want to know what Tim Walz's accomplishments are? We have them on paper. He supports the culture of death. Mothers need to realize, pregnant women need to realize, Tim Walz is not for protecting the unborn child. Tim Walz comes across as a very nice guy, but the packaging is very different from who Tim Walz is. People need to beware. Tim Walz would be a heartbeat away from being president of the United States.
You know, as a vocal Christian leader who's fought for America's freedom and, of course, supported Israel, she often sounds the alarm on destructive policies at play. And with the media that spends more time concealing rather than revealing things, we're so glad to have our dear friend Michelle Bachmann join us remotely. Good morning, Michelle. How are you?
Hi, Michelle.
I'm doing great, Doug. I'm doing great, Joni. Thank you so much for having me on today. I'm just so excited about everything Daystar is doing across the world. It's exciting.
You know, Michelle, I remember a meeting that you and I were both in Washington with Mike Pompeo, and the issue of Israel came up, and they were talking about how to resolve, you know, the things with the Palestinians and what can we do to bridge the gap, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember it came up on the table by several of the individuals there about possibly giving more land away. And I remember, I didn't know you that well back then, but you spoke up and you were so vocal and you were like, you cannot divide the land of Israel. You cannot, you know, and you were very strong in making your point about that. And so I know that as you hear what Daystar is doing to help Israel and bless Israel, I know that resonates with you, and that's really important that the body of Christ stand with Israel, isn't it?
Amen. And that our policies in our government are biblical policies, and that would include not putting pressure on Israel to divide its land nor to divide Jerusalem. So it's very important that Christians weigh in, especially in this upcoming election. We need to have leaders who support the Jewish people and the Jewish state.
Okay, so you know a little bit about Kamala Harris's VP pick, Governor Tim Walz, of course, has been chosen. Of course, as a former congresswoman from Minnesota, you've worked with him. So I want you to tell us about what you know about him and his accomplishments, et cetera, et cetera. I know you have a very clear view kind of what's going on. I don't know if you've been watching any of the DNC. I watched just a little bit last night. But just give us your thoughts as to your experience in working with him.
Well, Tim Walz and I were elected the same day to Congress. We were sworn in the same day in Congress. We served together for 8 years. We were on the plane together. I know his family. So yes, I do know Tim Walz over an 8-year relationship. Tim Walz comes across as a very nice guy. He's a backslapping, aw shucks kind of guy. But the packaging is very different from who Tim Walz is. People need to know Tim Walz was a high school social studies teacher who spent well over 10 years taking over 35 trips to communist China. He partnered with communist China to bring students to communist China to advance communism and the ideology of communism to impressionable Minnesota high school youth. So he's very much in the camp of communist China. Tim Walz then later, after he left Congress, became governor of our state. That's where I really want people to know what he did as governor, because it is stunning, it is shocking. He covered up for massive fraud in Minnesota from the Muslim community, specifically the Somali community. They had fraud of well over $100 million. Nothing happened. No one went to jail. There was no accountability. During COVID, there was over $250 million in fraud, again, from the Muslim Somali community. No one was held accountable. It came through the Minnesota Department of Education. It was the highest amount of fraud in the United States under COVID. Tim Walz looked the other way for the Muslim community. There's a new fraud that's happened in Minnesota under his watch, and he has done nothing on this new fraud dealing with education funds that should be going to kids for autism. Here's what he did. These are his, quote, accomplishments, Joni. I want everyone to listen carefully. Tim Walz passed the most egregious pro-abortion legislation in the United States. abortion is legal up to a moment that a baby has died. But we worked diligently for about 40 years on pro-life legislation. He repealed every single piece of pro-life legislation, including protections for those who are born from an abortion. Under Tim Walz, 8 babies died under Tim Walz from abortion because they were born alive. They were left to die. That was his legislation, that we would now leave babies to die when they're born in abortion. On transgender, we have the most radical transgender policy under Tim Walz in Minnesota. We're a, quote, sanctuary state for transgenders. But get this, if a child says to a teacher, I think I want to be a different sex, then, and the parents disagree, in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota under Tim Walz takes away the child, removes the child from the parent's home, and then the child is chemically castrated or physically mutilated. Once the state is done with the child, then the child is returned to the parents, and the parents are left with results, and the parents have to pay for all of the procedures. These are just a few things. He's also a big spender. He increased spending. We had a $17 billion surplus, and Tim Walz spent every bit of the $17 billion. He increased spending by 40% in the state, and he left taxpayers with a bill. We're now in a deficit. After being in surplus over $17 billion, we're now in a deficit. We've had more people leave our state since Tim Walz came in. 2 years ago, 19,000 Minnesotans left the state. Now over 30,000 people left the state last year. And it may be because he passed what's called net zero, carbon neutral. Minnesota is the coldest state in the union. We need energy in the wintertime. We can be 50 below zero with wind chill. He passed so that in Minnesota, we can only use solar and wind. Solar is 200% more expensive than regular sources of energy. Wind is 50% more expensive than any source of energy. We have to shut down all of our plants, whether they're nuclear plants, hydro plants, whether they're coal, whether they're natural gas. They're all being shut down now. We don't even have the solar and wind built, and yet that's the only sources of energy we're allowed to use in Minnesota. And it's why businesses are shutting down in Minnesota. They're leaving, people are leaving the state because they know they won't be able to handle these energy bills that are expected to be 4 times more expensive than people are paying now, in some cases 8 times more expensive than what people are paying now. Here's another reason why businesses are leaving Minnesota. He passed the Family Medical Leave Act. It sounds great, but what it does is it mandates that for any reason an employee wants, they cannot show up for work. Forget this, for 20 weeks a year. So at the employee's election, they can decide they don't want to go to work for up to 20 weeks a year. They can claim they're sick. They can claim that a family member has a problem and they have to help a family member. But the employer is stuck paying the wage for the employee. And so this is why businesses in Minnesota are closing up. They're leaving our state because they're saying, I can't afford to pay an employee for 20 weeks and I have to hire someone else and I can't fire them. I can't hire anyone else. These are the kind of policies he's put into place, including illegal aliens now get free health care. Illegal aliens are getting driver's license. Illegal aliens are getting free college in the state of Minnesota when Minnesota citizens can't afford to go to college. It's no one has ever seen anything like this. I've been involved in government, Doug and Joni, for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. I wrote a summary of what Tim Walz did. I can send it to you all so that you have it. And people need to see for themselves, because if you want to know what Tim Walz's accomplishments are, we have them on paper. How he's destroyed the state of Minnesota. So this isn't just a remark I'm making. The proof is in the pudding. People are leaving the state because they can no longer afford to live there. And also their faith is being damaged. Doug is a professional counselor. He's a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. In the state of Minnesota, If someone is a Christian psychologist or counselor and someone comes in and they're struggling with issues about sexuality and who they are, the counselor is prohibited from giving counsel to the person who's coming in and struggling. We're not allowed to do that. Also, when money was given to colleges in Minnesota, Christian colleges were not allowed to be involved in receiving money from the state of Minnesota. Secular schools, yes, not Christian. Tim Walz is a radical. Kamala Harris was voted the most radical liberal senator in the United States Senate. And that's why people need to know Tim Walz was the most radical governor of all 50 states, and he was invited by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Barack Obama to come to the White House, and he was showcased as a trophy. This is who we want to have as our governors across America. We want our governors to implement these policies. Well, if other governors do what Tim Walz does, there'll be no place to go in America to live. Thank God we have free states like Texas and Florida and other states. But the governors like Tim Walz who are putting these policies in place are making lives impoverished, miserable, and denying the faith of sincerely held beliefs of Christians in Minnesota. It's like nothing we've ever seen before.
Absolutely, Michelle. And I think you said you haven't seen this before. We've seen it. It's called communism. It's called Marxism, where you eventually run out of other people's money. I mean, $17 billion is a lot to spend, right? And so we have seen this. And I mean, he's not going to protect our children. You know, I want to talk to the moms just for a minute about what the children are at risk here.
Mothers need to realize, pregnant women need to realize, Tim Walz is not for protecting the unborn child. Even the born child, he repealed the law so that born children from abortion would be allowed to die, left on a table to die. The 8 babies, he did that too in the state of Minnesota. Any pro-life legislation. And for women who want to understand abortion, maybe women don't understand what happens in an abortion. Women in Minnesota had protections. He took that all away. He wants women to be ignorant, and he supports the culture of death. That babies would die. But women need to understand, for their little children, when they go off to preschool, when they go to elementary school, they're going to be schooled in radical education. He passed it in Minnesota. It is hating each other's race based upon our skin color. He put that in Minnesota. It's called ethnic studies, but it's meant to teach people to hate each other based upon the color of their skin. So the school curriculum is radical that he's put in place. He's in love with communist China and principles of communism. He wants youth to be taught the principles of communism. He did it in Minnesota, and he put it permanently in our state curricula in the state. And they're also putting in place the radical sexual education so that it's really advocating children and messing up children's mind for them to think, if they're a boy, maybe I really should be a girl, or vice versa. And if a child goes forward and says, I'm confused, I think maybe I want to know more. Now when the parents say no, the parents are pushed aside. It's the school district and the state that gets to take the child and change them. This is even worse than communist China and Russia under Stalin, because they didn't push this radical sexual agenda that Tim Walz has pushed in the state of Minnesota. Communism is one thing. This is a completely different revolution. It's full communism, but it's the add-on of denying faith to families, but also the state stepping in and saying, hey, we get to decide, not you parents. We're going to have control over your children. People need to beware. Tim Walz would be terrible as the vice president, because remember, he'd only be a heartbeat away from being president of the United States. And so we have to be forewarned. We have never had a ticket to vote for like Harris and Walz before. There's never been a more radical ticket. If they get in, they'll act quickly. Tim Walz did all of this in 1 year. In 1 year, in 2023, he did all this, and he did so much more that I haven't had time to tell you about, but it'll be on this document. I'll make sure that you have it within 5 minutes of me ending this segment, and I'll make it available for you.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for what you have been doing with your life. And actually, you're an example of women and men stepping into the public place and being a voice of light. So thank you for your life and your example. It's wonderful.